You're tuned in to Night Vision Radio, exposing the truth one secret at a time. Prepare yourself as we explore the shadow worlds of suppressed history, secret knowledge, forbidden religion, and shine a light on the conspiracies to keep it all from us. Welcome to Night Vision Radio. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Night Vision Radio. We have a special show planned for tonight. We're going to be exploring the Arcadian mysteries with Cort Lindahl. We're going to get into such favorites as Rennes-les-Chateau, Oak Island, Shugborough Hall, and gosh knows where else we'll end up. But before we do that, I wanted to take some time to recognize and pay tribute to a very special person that we lost yesterday. And a lot of you are very familiar with who I'm talking about, Jim Marrs, award-winning journalist and author. And I was thinking about, back on, the conversations and all the wonderful things that I learned from Jim Marrs and the great books of his that I read. And I was remembering that I actually met him through another friend who is on the line with us now and has agreed to come on and share some of his memories about Jim Marrs. And I'm talking about my old buddy, former research director for UFO Magazine. He's a published author, and he's also a radio show host, a popular show of his own. We're going to hear about that. But I'm talking about Don Ecker. Hey, Don, how are you?
Hey, Renee, I'm doing well. How about you?
I'm doing okay, but I tell you, it was kind of a gut punch today. I got a message from a friend of mine, and also someone who's been on my show a few different times, Lisa LaRue of the Cherokee tribe of Oklahoma. And Lisa and I are sort of research buddies, and she's also an avid Jim Marrs fan. And a few years back, Lisa and I got into some conversations about the Freemasons and how they had really infiltrated certain Indian tribes. And it was some really interesting stuff. I had a long conversation with Jim Marrs about it. And we had actually all talked about collaborating on something. And then I guess life got in the way, and we all got off on different things. Lisa went off and got married and moved back to Oklahoma, and all kinds of things happened. We didn't do it. But just a few days ago, very strangely, she wrote to me, and she had been studying some of these JFK papers that had recently been released. And she said, do you think that we could have Jim Marrs on your show, and I could come on and we could talk about, the JFK assassination? Because, of course, I guess Jim's probably most famous book, Don, would you agree, is Crossfire?
Well, he was, yes, his
He's
book
done
Crossfire
so
was a major work. Another major work of his was Alien Agenda.
Absolutely.
And Jim had,
I think that's the best-selling nonfiction book on UFOs of all time.
Yeah, Jim had called me up and had interviewed me rather extensively on my research into lunar phenomena. As a matter of fact, he had quite a bit in there at the beginning of the book. But when I heard about his dying yesterday, and it hit me, it was like a bolt out of the blue. Yeah. And I started thinking back about some of the encounters I had with Jim Marrs. Now, I knew Jim Renee, as you will remember, because you were a managing editor at UFO Magazine, I knew Jim going all the way back to the very early 1990s when we first connected. And I had interviewed him on my original show, UFOs Tonight, a number of times. And then I started thinking about a very funny incident that happened with Jim in Las Vegas about, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago. Vicki and I knew that Jim was going to be over in Vegas, and to tell you the truth, I even forget now what in the heck we needed to interview him for. But he was involved with something, and I had called him up at his home, and I said, you're going to be over there. We'll drive over and see you. He said, yeah, sure. So we ended up doing this interview with Jim, and after it was all said and done, Vicki was going to wander off somewhere, and somehow, Renee, it's going to be hard to believe, but we ended up in the bar.
Oh, no, okay? I don't believe that.
yeah, it's hard to believe, and I'll tell you what we were talking about. Now, Jim was from Texas.
Oh, yeah.
There's always something about Texas that just fascinated me to no end. And that was the Alamo, the Battle of the Alamo, all the way back in 1836. So we started talking about that. We sat down and we ordered a drink, and suddenly Jim told me, he said, well, he said, I'm in a group of reenactors, or he was in a group of reenactors. And I'm thinking, oh, the Texas Revolution. Yeah, I do. Who were you, Jim? Davy Crockett? Mm-hmm. Oh, no. He said, I was in the Mexican Army.
All right.
I said, are you kidding? He said, nope. He said, I was a Mexican artilleryman. We had the cannons. So he started spinning this yarn about how they would get out there and they'd get the cannon all loaded, and the officer would yell, "Fuego!" Boom! We're sitting
Fire!
There, I'm cracking up. So I don't know if it was Jim or me, one of us. And honest to God, if I remembered, I'd tell you. But one of us said, well, we ought to have a shot at tequila. So the girl brought us over each a shot of tequila, and we're talking, and I downed my shot, and I yelled, "Fuego!" And Mars shot his down, and we got another. And before you know it, we had about 6 or 8 shots of tequila in us. Now, I don't know what you know about tequila, but Renee, that can sneak up on you. And suddenly this little girl came walking by selling cigars. And I looked, and I'm always a sucker for a good cigar. And we looked at these things, and honest to God, by this time they looked like they were 2 feet long. And I said, Jim, what do you think? Should we get a cigar? Hell yeah, let's get a cigar. So we got these cigars. They were Mexican cigars. And we're sitting in there and, well, what do you think, Don? Should we get another shot of tequila? Why not? And all I can tell you is that night melted into a fog. But, buddy, the next morning did I remember that. Oh.
And probably regretted it, and rightfully so.
Oh, my God, yes. And I told him from that point forward, I said, Mars, no more tequila.
Oh, my gosh. That's hilarious. I tell you, he was such a good storyteller, wasn't he? I mean, I have to say, I didn't hold the fact that he was from Texas against him, even though we were arch enemies. That's right. That's right. We don't get along. But I didn't hold that against him. And I tell you, I love to hear him, talk and tell stories. He had such a way about him. He was pretty amazing. We had him on this radio station quite a bit. Now, MJ Lucas, our producer for NightVision, he's also one of the station owners. you had some interaction, MJ. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here, Jim. I was
Yeah.
I was privileged to produce a number of his shows. He is also one of the awesome hosts on Epic Voyages for quite a few years there. But in between the shows, just his humor and his uplifting talk, he was great. And the thing I'll always remember about Jim is, his JFK research was impeccable. I was always glued to the show or the podcast every time he was on talking about that research. But yeah, he was a good man, very, very lighthearted and awesome. Glad we were able to work with him as a network.
Absolutely. One of a kind.
Yeah.
Now, Dawn, you probably know more about this because I've been asleep at the wheel on the JFK assassination thing. But Lisa LaRue, who has been researching it, was saying, she was so upset, about Jim's passing because she really wanted a chance to, have a conversation with him about some of these documents that have been released. But then I guess there's supposed to be a lot more released. And she said, gosh, I know Jim has probably been waiting for these documents since 1963. And I'm so sorry that, he wasn't here to see the release of all of them. Do you know what documents she's talking about, Dawn?
No. And to, quite honestly, I haven't seen any of these new documents yet. But here's a thought that may be comforting. He probably is aware of the whole shebang now, Renee.
Well, absolutely. And I have to say that thought did cross my mind this afternoon. I thought, well, he knows it all now.
Yeah. if he wanted to get
a message back to us.
Yeah, if he wanted to get a real who's who and who did what to who and what have you, I'm sure he's got it. He's got it by now.
Absolutely. Well, he was a great guy and just an amazing author, great writer, and a good talker. That's what I can say best about Jim. And I know that his loved ones and his family are going to miss him. And I'm just wishing them all the comfort and peace that they can possibly have around this. They had a wonderful guy there, and he was a real treat to a lot of us.
I got to tell you, I enjoyed every time I had a chance to sit down and talk with Jim. He was just the most charming and congenial man. And, even when he would, for my taste, get a little out there on some of these things. And I got to tell you, there were a number of things that Jim came up with that I just had a hard time accepting at face value. In other words, I'd have to see a heck of a lot more proof. But when it came to being a hard-nosed digger, getting into the stuff, there was the guy that did it.
Yep, absolutely. I remember reading some of his stuff on, the Iraq War, and I mean, he covered a lot of ground. Absolutely. But, and I wanted to mention, you mentioned Vicki before, and of course, we're talking about your lovely wife, Vicki Cooper Ecker, who was the founder or co-founder and editor-in-chief and publisher of UFO Magazine for many, many years. And I worked there. Dawn was the research director for the magazine. And Dawn, of course, had a radio show with actor Dwight Schultz over a number of years called UFOs Tonight. And I had the privilege of being their producer and announcer, or co-producer, because Jeff was there also. And their announcer for that show. And we had a ball. And I want to tell you, Don, I was talking about, when I was thinking back about, Jim today and what was my first connection with Jim. And I, of course, traced it back to you. And then I started thinking about it. And I thought, I met a lot of really, really outstanding people through you. I met Ingo Swann, who was a good friend of yours. I met Zechariah Sitchin. And I met Jim Mars, and there are more, but those are just
John Keel.
Well, I didn't meet John. Well, I actually talked to John Keel over the phone, and we've got a huge John Keel fan listening right now. I see her in the chat room, so she's going to be happy that we mentioned John Keel. But yes, had the privilege of talking to John Keel and arranging the shows, and as he was on UFOs Tonight. And now you're doing another radio show, which you've been doing for a number of years.
Well, since 2004, I've been doing the original, the
original
only,
Dark Matters.
Dark Matters Radio. Okay, even though other people, no names mentioned, like Art Bell, tried to steal my name. Back in 2004, I began it with, Dwight Schultz. We did it for a year. And then I went through a couple of other networks. I just left a network that I did DMR on for 7 years. I am now on KGRA Radio, which is a real up-and-coming network. My shows are 5 to 7 p.m. Pacific time on Fridays and Saturdays. Friday nights, I do my live interviews. Tomorrow night, I'm interviewing astrologer, actually renowned astrologer, Jeff Harmon. And then Saturday is our open line show with Richard Saraday. So, we've been banging right along.
Oh, that sounds great, Don. Well, I want to thank you for coming on and sharing some memories about Jim Mars. And it was nice. It was fun. It's always fun to remember the good times when we're so sad. So we want to pay all tribute to Jim Mars, and we thank him for his great work. And thank you, Don, for being with us tonight.
And you betcha. And in the immortal words of Jim Mars, René, Fuego!
All right. Thank you, Don. All right, now we're going to move right on into the Arcadian Mysteries, which was our regularly scheduled show tonight with author, researcher Cort Lindahl. Cort, are you with me?
I am here.
Oh, thank you for hanging in there, Cort. Appreciate it.
No problem. It was great to give tribute to Jim. Yes.
Sure was. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We couldn't let it pass by without a real good, solid mention. So now, what you and I have been buzzing on Skype about for the last however many years, but it's been all coming to fruition. You've got some great research in connecting up many of these so-called Arcadian mysteries. We're talking about mysteries like Rennes-les-Chateau, Shugborough Hall, Oak Island, and I have to say, we're also connecting into the United States. So it's not just France, it's not just Europe, and it's not just Canada anymore. You've connected it right on down into California, among other places. But where did you want to kick off tonight? Because I told you it's up to you where we start off.
Well, we could start by giving a broad definition of the Arcadian mysteries, which I believe.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
This includes Stirling Castle in Scotland, Shugborough Hall, Rennes-les-Chateau, and Oak Island, and if not, extending to other places I've written about, like Williamsburg and the Frenchman's Tower in Palo Alto, California. And what I found along the way are some definite genealogy that links all of these places together, kind of via the Jacobite movement of the exiled kings of England and Scotland, the Stuart family. We're talking about James II, James III, and Bonnie Prince Charlie, that kind of left a legacy behind in their exile that, in part, I think these mysteries are meant to tell us about their history and remind us that they were there as they were exiled, and history kind of sweeps these people aside sometimes. And most interestingly, later we see it linking to the exiled French king of France, Henri V, who I had earlier linked to the Frenchman's Tower in Palo Alto.
Now,
And
can we go to that? Because I know that, a lot of people that are listening are what I call Rennies, and everyone that is familiar with the Rennes-les-Chateau mystery, of course, is very familiar with the Tour Magdala in Rennes-les-Chateau, a strange Gothic structure that Berenger Saunier had built during his time there in the late 19th century or early 20th century. I'm not sure what the actual date, I'm sure you know the date of the tower's construction was. But can you tell us how this tower relates to the tower that you're talking about in Palo Alto, California, which actually predates the Tour Magdala?
Yes, well, really what we'll get to is that it all relates to the De la Tour group of families in France and their relation to the Stuarts, the exiled kings of Scotland. And we see this relation not only through James II, Bonnie Prince Charlie's grandfather, who through his wife, Maria Sobieska, I believe was her correct name, her sister was intermarried with the De la Tours. And this later, Bonnie Prince Charlie would actually have an affair with his first cousin, Louise de la Tour, that produced a child that was never heard from again or noted in history after its birth. But it's interesting that there's this loop, through his grandfather, that he had an affair actually with his first cousin. And then later, he would have a liaison with Clementina Walkinshaw of Scotland and have an issue of his daughter Charlotte, who was the exiled Duchess of Albany. And she in turn would have an affair with a member of the De la Tour family and have 3 children that are seldom known in history, but later there was a gentleman from Harvard that wrote a book about them, and that's extensively documented that they existed and did attempt to claim some of their family right from England at that time. So what we see is this group of families intermarried also with people like Thomas Coutts, who owned a huge banking concern in England that loaned a great deal of money to people like Henri V, or later his descendants did, who controlled the same bank, but also was said to have controlled all the money of the exiled Stuart family. And he was indeed related to Bonnie Prince Charlie's paramour, Clementina Walkinshaw. So this even relates them together. And Thomas Coutts showed a great deal of concern for his daughter's children, and they were friends with his children and everything, and they spent a lot of time together, and this is all documented in books and everything. But what we see in the Frenchman's Tower in Palo Alto, California is in 1875, and this is a good 15 to 20 years before Father Saunier started to expose this mystery of Rennes-les-Chateau, where a man named Peter Coutts came to Mayfield, California, which would become Palo Alto, where Stanford University is in the South Bay area. And among the follies on the Ayrshire farm that he built, which is important too, because Ayrshire is a Scottish name, and the Coutts family are Scottish, and this is also the same family as Colt Firearms, by the way, later in the United States. It's the same family where they both used either the Colt or the Coutts name, even far back in Scottish history. It's just a different spelling because the L is kind of silent in Gaelic. And so it even sounds similar. Colt, it would be Colt or Coutts. It's the same name, and there's even a book that documents all their relations and everything, the Coutts and Colt genealogy.
Oh my gosh! Yes, I didn't realize that was the same family.
Right, it is. It's very intertwined with American history.
What year was the Frenchman's Tower built there in Palo Alto?
It was built in 1875.
And then what year was the Tour Magdala built? Didn't you say it was like 6 years later or something?
It was built in the 1890s. the late 18th or early 20th century. Even I'm not really square on that. I know I read that before. It's just one of the facts that are eluding me at the moment. But it was a significant amount of time later. So what we see kind of is the same family group creating a similar thing involving a tower in California even before. And the trail of links between the same people that we'll later talk about involved at Rennes-les-Chateau is undeniable, between the Frenchman's Tower in Palo Alto, Peter Coutts, to the De La Tour family, and other families in England as well.
Now, wasn't there something about, and you correct me if I'm wrong, because you filled my head with so many facts, Cort, that you know I have trouble keeping them all straight. But wasn't there something about the architect of the towers? What was it, the same architect, or was it just the same family ordering, having something to do or paying for the towers? What was the actual family connection?
Right. Well, we'll see the Coutts Bank later financing Henri V, as they did many other nobility of Europe and England and Scotland. And a lot of theories present evidence, such as from Society Perios, that Henri V's family was behind paying for the Tour Magdalene and Villa Bethania at Rennes-les-Chateau. And really, that we see the same thing, the connections I made at the Frenchman's Tower, which I believe was in part built to be due south of Mount Shasta, and we can follow these same family connections into the legends of Mount Shasta and all the kind of mythology and lore we see there. And I know this sounds far out and hard to grasp if we've all been in studying the Rennes-les-Chateau mystery, but what we're seeing is a series of these towers built kind of in the namesake of the De La Tour family, which is of the tower, literally in French,
right,
that are involved in this. And we even see parts of their family on their family arms having the Cathar cross, or the same cross that is the symbol of the Languedoc-Roussillon, and a tower. So we know also that Magdala means tower as well.
Yeah.
So all of these links are there in kind of the mythology of Mary Magdalene, and the way all of these families are related to the Plantagenet dynasty of France and England. That's one thing in common with all of these families. They have those links. And we see in the case of the Scottish exile kings that they intermarried with French families in their exile, and Polish families in the case of James II that had these same connections. So that leads to kind of a symbolic value by De La Tour. And we even see them intermarrying with the Blanchefort family, who of course is a well-known name to those that are familiar with Rennes-les-Chateau. And really, the missing or destroyed headstone that Father Saunière found was one of the things that clued Henry Lincoln into the pentagonal geometry in the landscape. And really, the headstone only included 3 points of the star. And what we see is that part of the star that was defined on the headstone, pointing a line to the King's Knot at Stirling Castle, that matches the octagonal form of the King's Knot there, if we view this on the globe. And the same arc on the globe passes directly over Shugborough Hall's Tower of the Winds, where we also see an additional Arcadian theme. And that's something I need to stress. We're seeing, and of course,
Shugborough Hall is the home of the Ansons, who are Stuarts.
Former Earls of Lichfield were related and Stuarts.
Right.
But what we see at each of these places in Stirling Castle is a region of Scotland that was referred to as Arcadia. And I was doing research into my own family Sutherland genealogy and came across wills and deeds that named the land Arcadia in the mid-13th century.
And where was that exactly?
In the area surrounding Stirling Castle in Scotland.
Oh, wow.
So then we see the Arcadian theme then repeated by the Ansons in the Shepherd's Monument at Shugborough Hall, along with the Tower of the Winds. And then we go to Rennes-les-Chateau, and the same imagery is suggested by the headstone that was destroyed and the pentagonal landscape geometry that Henry Lincoln found there. And all along the whole way at each place are descendants of the Plantagenets and Stuarts at each location where these Arcadian themes are stressed. So that, to me, that has to be more than a coincidence. We're being told this at all three of those places, in architecture, in history, and even in literature.
And go ahead.
No, it's okay. All of them, they're just all related via the Arcadian theme, and if you look into it, you can see the whole Jacobite kind of cause mixed with when the exiled kings in France happened that they're family with. I mean, even Henri V's wife was one of the people that's in line for the claim of the Scottish crown because she descended from Charles I's daughter, Henrietta of England. So Henry V, even his wife was a Stuart. So it's this interrelationship that Scotland and France has always had in history that England didn't, to a large extent. The lots of intermarriage, like Mary Queen of Scots, her mother Marie of Guise, and other intermarriages between the Scottish and English kings and the French. So this created a lot of family ties through the years that, especially when James II was exiled, that these family ties became important to the survival of the exiled court of James II and subsequently Bonnie Prince Charlie as well. So what they were doing, in part, is kind of weaving a mythology that reminds you that they were there and of what they did and who their families were and the kind of things they valued, like the concept of Mary Magdalene that fits.
If you have a Lowe's Advantage card, you can get an extra 5% off every day on items big or small. So you can save an extra 5% on a new coat of paint, updating appliances, replacing the flooring, and even save an extra 5% on little things like cleaning supplies, laundry detergent, and air filters. The big to-dos to the everyday essentials. You get an extra 5% savings every day when you use your Lowe's Advantage card. If you don't have one, apply today. All projects have a starting point. Start with Lowe's. Subject to credit approval and can't be combined with any other credit offers. Exclusions apply. See store for details. U.S. only.
And with the Plantagenet value and the kind of mythology we see linking them to the blood of Jesus Christ. And I was interested when I dove into that they believe they're related to St. James as well, Santiago.
Wow. That's what I was going to ask you about just a moment ago, because I know that this is about a lot of this has to do with these fallen kings and these deposed royals and wanting to sort of leave behind, signs and, maybe markings and things like that. But also, you had mentioned to me that it was also reflective. A lot of these things are reflective of some of their own beliefs, which might have or would have been considered heretical, and as certainly their value of the goddess, or particularly of Mary Magdalene. And it's interesting because, like you said, Tour Magdala is actually Tour. And I know that in a lot of, and I believe it's Masonic material, I know in certain material I've read where they've referred to Mary Magdalene as the tower.
Sure.
When they talk about the tower, they're talking about Mary Magdalene. So is the de la Tour family building towers because their name is Tower, and it's sort of a sign, okay, this is our place because it's a tower? Or is their name because somehow derived from their reverence for Mary Magdalene, their name de la Tour? Does that have something to do? And how did that name evolve? Do you know?
No, they're originally from the Lorraine province, which is part of, the border areas between Belgium, France, and Germany now. And they are descendant of the Dukes of Bouillon, including Godefroy de Bouillon, the first Grand Master of the Knights Templar and first King of Jerusalem. I'm not sure if their blood directly related to him, but several of the descendant de la Tours that took this title, the Dukes of Bouillon, also later, they held that title, were named Godfrey.
Godfrey de Bouillon. Yeah,
right,
absolutely.
Right. So they're at least paying homage to Godfrey de Bouillon, and this brings us our Knights Templar connection to everything as well in that realm. So even really what I found were that the lords of the Rennes-les-Chateau and Rennes-les-Bains area, I found a book called Voyage à Rennes-les-Bains, written in 1832 by Laboureuse Roquefort. Excuse me if I didn't pronounce that correctly, but his mother was a de la Tour. And in the book, it tells about how at one point during the 1600s or 17th century that one of the lords of that region was Magdalene de la Tour.
Magdalene, that's right. Yeah, you sent me that.
So even the name is involved in their values of their family and everything. And of course, they're related to the Anjous, who the whole story of Charles II discovering the remains of Mary Magdalene at Saint Maximin in southern France near Marseille also fits into the story as well. And so even the church itself, who would think the alternate views of Mary Magdalene were heretical, also had a value of her on their own terms as well. So yes, we do see part of the mystery here, especially at Rennes-les-Chateau, inferring that Jesus and Mary had children, and this is part of the Plantagenet dynasty. And we even see his name's escaping me now, the man at Rennes-les-Chateau who brought the whole thing up, who was a Plantard, Pierre Plantard.
Oh, Pierre Plantard, right. Pierre Plantard de St. Clair.
Right, so he was knowledgeable of this, I believe. I mean, he at least had figured out the family connections and everything, that he could try to claim that because of what his name was.
Well, I tell you, as you know, I've known Henry Lincoln, one of the co-authors of Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and you mentioned him earlier. I've known him for many, many years and spent many hours in conversations with him. And I know that there's been a lot of people, calling Pierre Plantard a total hoaxer, a total fake. And but Henry Lincoln knew Pierre Plantard personally and ended up knowing him for a number of years. And I tell you, Henry's a crusty old guy. He doesn't get sentimental about much, but he always gets a very wistful look about him when he's talking about Pierre Plantard. And I know that he, to this day, truly believes that there was something to Pierre Plantard. And,
right.
Interestingly, Pierre Plantard, Henry went to interview him for television, and then he decided he didn't want to do it. So he was going to interview Jean-Luc Chomet instead. And so I guess Jean-Luc was getting his ponytail combed and getting all ready to go on the air. And at the last minute, Pierre Plantard approached Henry and he says, I'll do it, on one condition. And Henry said, what's that? And he said that he can be in the interview with me. And he pointed down to his, I think then 8-year-old son, Thomas. And Henry said, well, of course, but why? And he said, because he's the important one. And it always made me wonder, about what he meant by that. And did that indicate, that there really truly is some sort of a family line thing to all this mystery, which, of course, ties into to what you're saying. Yes. But I know that Henry believed in the veracity of Pierre Plantard, and Henry is not an easy guy. He doesn't believe too much. He doesn't believe anything he can't verify for himself. I know that.
Right. Well, Plantard could have known the truth regardless of whatever his motives were in coming forward. I mean,
sure.
He he could have done the genealogy and the research if he had put the time in to find out these kind of things that I'm exposing here as well. And then he may have seen that he had, or thought or believed he had a family connection where he could put these ideas forward. And regardless of whatever else happened, and I'm sure, if he did that, there would be a lot of people who would want to dispute what he was saying or even make him look bad for saying it. And it's, you were speaking of Henry and how sometimes he says that all of this may lead to America.
Yes, he said that.
The United States, that I think that's true. And part of what I found was even intermarried with the De La Tours at an earlier time and a later time was the Marquis de Lafayette's family, the famous hero of the American Revolution, who was also a member of an organization called the Society of the Cincinnati that was composed of Revolutionary War officers and one of their lineal male descendants. And this group had dedicated itself to helping the formation of republics around the world, and we may see some of their influence in the French Revolution. But what we have is the Marquis de Lafayette's daughter marrying into the de la Tour d'Auvergne family, the exact family group I'm speaking of that's related to Bonnie Prince Charlie, the exiled king of Scotland, England, and Ireland. And also an earlier ancestor of his also marrying into the same family group in the generation just before him. So he was also from the same region, the Auvergne region of France that this family is from, that's just somewhat north of the Languedoc-Roussillon region today.
Now, that De La Tour family, before we get away from them, I don't know if we are getting away from them, but
there's no escape. There's no escape.
No escaping the De La Tours. But, you mentioned, obviously, we talked about the Frenchman's Tower in the Tour Magdala, and Leslie in the chat room mentioned something that I was thinking about too, and she mentioned the tower at Girona. Have you linked that in any way? Oh, yes. Tell us.
That's definitely part of the same kind of values during the age of Father Saunière. If you look into Girona, there's a great documentary on Vimeo called Girona, City of Secrets. That involves Patrice Chaplin telling her story of Girona and how Father Saunière used to go there to meet with a woman, and there was a Torre Magdala there, and that she had witnessed Jean Cocteau and others doing rituals in the Torre Magdala there. And that kind of links to the late 19th century and early 20th century occult values of this. And really we get to every place where the Arcadian mysteries, as I call them, occur, there's also usually a treasure legend attached. And we see
you mentioned Jean Cocteau. He was the artist and painter who was also purported to be one of the Grand Masters of the Priory of Zion.
Exactly. So there's all these links to that mythology as well in what was going on in Girona. And Girona is a really interesting place that even has a history with Charlemagne, legends that he came there and gifted a chalice to the church there in Girona. And all of that really is very similar to what we see at Rennes-les-Chateau, and even Patrice Chaplin and some of the other people that have looked at that say there are direct connections between there and Rennes-les-Chateau. And some of the geographic connections I found too in the octagonal scheme of the Rennes-les-Chateau chapel points to the church there in Girona and things like that. So those connections could be real as well. But Girona may actually be kind of during the same era in which we see the Tour Magdala being built in Rennes-les-Chateau and the Frenchman's Tower, where these things are being built to ensure the legacy of Henri V, whose wife is a steward as well, as I discussed. So there's also during this era links especially in the story of the Frenchman's Tower and all the rest of this with the Coutts family who intermarried with the Stuart family, Lord Dudley Coutts Stuart, who actually married the daughter of Lucien de Bonaparte. And Lucien Bonaparte was somewhat opposed to Napoleon. So this is kind of the French opposition to the Napoleonic regime that harkens us back to the whole concept of Arcadia being a utopia. But in their minds, this is also the ancient regime of France in which the kings ruled, and they viewed that kind of feudal system as a utopia, or being able to produce that kind of lifestyle of Arcadia. So there are those connections to everything as well. And all along the way, the Stuarts and De la Tours are involved in really at first, a lot of the impetus may have come from Bonnie Prince Charlie at Rennes-les-Chateau, and then his relation to Henri V, that they chose to take up the theme of Arcadia too. And of course, since the mid-1600s, we have the Académie de Arcadia of the Vatican, which was a literary and artist group of people kind of dedicated, like the Society of the Cincinnati in the United States, as well as to presenting their point of view in art and literature as well. So this is kind of a silent war going on in the media of the day, where they use artists, artist guilds and everything, and you even see those overtones in the concept of the Priory of Zion, which reminds me a lot of the Academy of Arcadia as well. And we know Nicolas Poussin was a member of the Academy of Arcadia, and he painted the Shepherds of Arcadia that became kind of one of the clues that were presented with in the Rennes-les-Chateau mystery.
And wasn't Nicolas Poussin also listed as a Grand Master of the Priory?
I'm not sure about that personally.
I'm going to have to look that up, but
right.
Before I give out bad information.
No, it would make sense if it were true, and that's one reason the existence of that could well be true, because this kind of guilds of artists and writers and everything helped to control the media at this time and present the views of the rulers and everything, and make sure these kinds of things were in the public consciousness as well. So everybody had their point of view, and if you could get a group of artists, and this includes the troubadours, the whole concept of actors and everything, that presents these kind of ideas to the public. So that's part of the whole thing. As it moves along, we really see a writers' guild in England during the era of Sir Francis Bacon, known as the Wilton Writers' Circle, from which the work entitled Arcadia comes from, that really, I feel, goes a long way towards solving the Oak Island mystery.
Just for the record, Nicolas Poussin was not listed as one of the Grand Masters of the Priory of Zion. Of course, Leonardo da Vinci was. And then, of course, there was a Nicholas. It was Nicolas Flamel, the alchemist, and then he was the one just prior to René d'Anjou, which, we were just talking about the d'Anjou family. So, right. Wow, they're all in there. And then, of course, Jean Cocteau was the purported last Grand Master before Pierre Plantard, and then we don't know after that if there was one, or if there ever was.
Fits the whole scheme of these kind of groups of people, going all the way back to Dante, in which we see kind of a liberal form of literature forming that inspired people like Sir Francis Bacon, William Shakespeare, and even Edgar Allan Poe and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who were two people that I feel were exposed to all of these mysteries due to their association with the Society of the Cincinnati, of which Thomas Jefferson and the Marquis de Lafayette were members. So all of this does link to an American understanding of that, because really, in a large part, the Jacobite movement of Bonnie Prince Charlie helped to create the United States of America in a large way, even though they have an association with the Catholic Church. And this also leads us to our alliance with the French through his family relations to even people like the Marquis de Lafayette to promote these kind of values through the Society of the Cincinnati, who kind of developed these writers to present their point of view, and I think in the process to hide some hints that all of this is true in their works. And we see that in Nicolas Poussin and even Georges de la Tour later, who the paintings I've been posting on the chat board there of Magdalene Penitent shows his knowledge and value of Mary Magdalene, as his family had this value, in my opinion.
Wow. Well, now, we were talking about, we mentioned Henry, and you mentioned the fact that he had brought up America. What he said to me exactly was, if you really want to tell this story right, you have to go to America. So that was his exact words, or as close as I can remember. So I know that he had some interest in the South, in Louisiana, and the Cajuns, who, of course, that's the bastardized version of Acadians, who came down from, I guess, Canada, right? Came across from France and then down into Louisiana from Canada. Is that correct?
Right. They were exiled there when the English took over, and the history of Acadia or Nova Scotia, has the French controlling it, then the Scottish colony, and then the English taking it back, and at various times people being made to leave. But the big time when that happened was in 1710, when British General Lawrence basically took over Nova Scotia, and at first a lot of them were expelled. Many went back to France, and many went to Louisiana, which was still part of New France at the time.
Okay, now you're mentioning Lawrence. Now I know that it was a Lawrence who owned the property on which the so-called Poussin tomb, but the real name for it was the Pontiel tomb. A man named Lawrence from the United States owned that property.
Right.
And is that the same Lawrence family we're talking about?
I believe it is. I've come really close to connecting that via genealogy, but haven't been able to. I think it's very possible, and it's interesting, too, that George Washington's brother, Lawrence, took his name from the Lawrence family due to their relationship. And really what we'll get to here soon is how the Oak Island story even links to the formation of Washington, D.C., via these family groups that I'm speaking of that kind of were Scottish and had great allegiance to the French as well through their marriages and political allegiances. And this includes the De La Tour family in a very big way. But really, to tell that whole story correctly, we'd have to go back to Elizabethan times to a man named Philip Sidney. Right. Who was the brother of Mary Sidney Herbert, the Countess of Pembroke, who coincidentally, her two sons married the two daughters of the 17th Earl of Oxford de Vere, and the first folio of Shakespeare was dedicated to these two men because of their patronage of the arts. So this is the nephews of Philip Sidney. And Philip Sidney produced a literary work for his sister entitled Mary Pembroke's Arcadia.
Arcadia. Yeah.
Yes, and this is the book that I've been speaking of recently online that includes what I believe to be the original Oak Island treasure story, even though this book was published in 1580, over 200 years prior to the modern legend of Oak Island that tells us three young men saw strange lights on the island and rowed out one night and found the depression in the ground with the ship's tackle above, and excavated their way through 9 layers of logs to find a strange stone that had an encoded message on it. And after they had removed the stone, they came back the next day to work, and the pit had flooded. So the very similar story is present in Arcadia, that has a man digging through layers of logs and stones to get to a strange stone, but when he removes it, the whole thing had been revealed as a bad joke that somebody had sent him on a fool's errand. And it fits in kind of with the whole theme of Arcadia, also involving pirates and treasure chests being mentioned in the beginning of the book. And then as the story progresses, which is a really funny story involving knights and drag. It's a Shakespearean era comedy, sort of, in many ways, but there's a lot of things hidden in there. And it's really interesting. As I studied Arcadia, I found that a man named William Alexander, the first Earl of Stirling, had amended this work in about 1613 to 1620. And William Alexander of Stirling, coincidentally, was the first Baron of Nova Scotia, which at that time was taken from the French, and their name of it is Acadia, which of course means Arcadia.
Yeah.
So here we have the first Baron of Nova Scotia contributing and editing a work entitled Arcadia that also includes a story very similar to the Oak Island treasure story. And as I even researched further, the first French governor of Nova Scotia was a man named Charles de la Tour.
Oh, boy.
And he's directly related to the same family groups I've been speaking of before. There's plenty of documented evidence that shows his direct relation to the same family group that Bonnie Prince Charlie and his father were associated with, of the de la Tour family. But of course, this is much earlier. But it's amazing because even Charles de la Tour's father, Claude, was married to a woman named Maria de Salazar, who was related to William Alexander, the first Earl of Stirling. Both Claude de la Tour and Charles de la Tour, the first French governor of Acadia, were made barons of Nova Scotia. So no matter who controlled Nova Scotia, the Scottish interest had some power there via family. And early on, Claude de la Tour was captured by the English and was given a baronetcy of Nova Scotia and tried to convince his son, Charles, to just come over to the Scottish colony side and disown the French, but he refused to do this, and they actually had an armed conflict between father and son. So as time went on through a long series of events, Charles de la Tour was ejected from Acadia by a rival faction of colonists, and in 1654 the English re-invaded Acadia, and he was invited back and accepted his title of Baron of Nova Scotia and worked with the English and Scottish interests there. So you even see these men switching sides and allegiances with whoever ruled Nova Scotia. And this is the de la Tour family, who also... It's
strange, though. It's strange
intermarried with the de Body family.
Oh, my gosh.
The great cyclic cross of Vendée.
I was going to ask you, when we were talking about the Girona Tower, I was going to ask you, sort of between the... somewhere in between the Tour Magdalene and the Girona Tower sits the Great Cross of Vendée, and I'm sure there has to be a connection to that as well. All these things, all these symbols and structures, it seems like they're all related back to the same people. It's crazy.
They are, and a lot of the overtones at each of these places of mystery are Enochian. Even the 9 layers of logs in the money pit and the stone at the bottom match the Book of Enoch with the 9 chambers and the encoded stones in the 9th chamber. So during this late 19th century or late 18th century and early 19th century period, even Freemasonry valued these Enochian concepts over the Solomonic concepts that are later become associated with Freemasonry. So at the time, even the Oak Island treasure was exposed in about 1795, there was a great appreciation of the Book of Enoch and those kind of metaphors and symbols. And that's why I was even amazed to find that James Bruce, the famous Ethiopian explorer who returned from Ethiopia with 3 ancient copies of the Book of Enoch, had written a book about his travels there to Lord Halifax, the namesake of Halifax, Nova Scotia.
Oh, geez.
So the connections are endless, and really that was a big coup for him to be able to obtain these ancient copies, because it verified the kind of beliefs, even in Freemasonry and other Rosicrucian circles and everything, that link us also to the man in the mountain mythology of Charlemagne, and these kind of hidden treasures and crypt stories that occur at each place the Arcadian mysteries that manifest themselves.
Well, they sure do. Cort, we're going to have to take a quick break, but I want to definitely get into that aspect of it, because that is really interesting. Because as you were talking about those, of course, I was thinking about the mysteries involving, something buried or someone buried in the region of Rennes-les-Chateau, and it seems like there's always, or a sleeping queen in the mountain, that sort of thing. It seems like we do find that in all these locations, and I want you to talk a little bit more about that after the break. So when we come back, more with Cort Lindahl, and we're also going to find out how to see more and read more of Cort when we get back. Stay with us. Welcome back to Night Vision. I'm your host, Renee Barnett. If you're just joining us, we have Cort Lindahl back with us tonight. I said I announced on my Facebook today that I was starting a new reality show called Catching Up with Cort. You've heard of Keeping Up with the Kardashians. Well, this is a little bit higher brow than that, I might say. And we're talking about Cort Lindahl and his great research into, oh my goodness, history like you wouldn't believe. So now, Cort, before we get started, back on what we were talking about, can you share with us, how do we find your videos? How do we get your books? Because you've got a lot of information, and I would suggest getting the books, because then you have them there in front of you. You can, I mark mine. I hate to say that, but I do, and because I want to go back to certain things. They're great reference books. My goodness, they offer a storehouse of information. So also the videos are good though too. So how do we see all that, Cort?
Right. Well, you can look on YouTube at the Cort Lindahl channel, and there's over 120 videos there that I've made over the years. And recently, my series, Mysteries and Legends of Northern California, Mount Shasta Revealed, is there. That
If you have a Lowe's Advantage card, you can get an extra 5% off every day on items big or small. So you can save an extra 5% on a new coat of paint, updating appliances, replacing the flooring, and even save an extra 5% on little things like cleaning supplies, laundry detergent, and air filters. The big to-dos to the everyday essentials. You get an extra 5% savings every day when you use your Lowe's Advantage card. If you don't have one, apply today. All projects have a starting point. Start with Lowe's. Subject to credit approval and can't be combined with any other credit offers. Exclusions apply. See store for details. U.S. only.
kind of explains a lot of the Enochian overtones that I've been discussing. And you can get all my books just by word searching Cort Lindahl books. They're all available on Amazon.com and CreateSpace.com. And there's links on my blog, survivalcell.blogspot.com, as well, to book sales and the Cort Lindahl page on Facebook. So it's all there.
Yeah, I would definitely suggest the books, because they're great, especially if you're doing any kind of research at all into these matters. They're all connected, as you see. It used to sound crazy, when people would say, oh, this is connected to this and this is connected to that. But what's wonderful, Cort, about your work is that you're showing us why and how they're connected. And it's not just some crazy magic thing out there in the universe, where everything's just magically connected. These are all connected by families throughout history and bloodlines. So now, I have to say, now, where did you want to pick up?
Well, we were talking about how a lot of these things resembled the man in the mountain mythology and kind of Rosicrucian philosophy of Christian Rosenkreutz being interred in a mountain with a library of important Gnostic or hidden information.
Which, of course, brings to mind like Mount Shasta in the Saint Germain legends there. Now, Saint Germain, there really was a Saint Germain connection, though, there, wasn't there?
Yes, and in addition, he has some kind of distant relations to the Stuart family via his brother's marriage as well. So he's related to Elizabeth of Bohemia and Prince Rupert of the Rhine even, and the current Stuart monarchs of England, distantly. So it's interesting that he does possess that relation, given the kind of information that I speculated about the Frenchman's Tower being related to Mount Shasta, because it's due south of Mount Shasta. If you create an axis out of the Frenchman's Tower, you see that a meridian is created that connects it to Mount Shasta. So I believe they're referencing the man in the mountain mythology and the same kind of philosophy and legends that we see being shown to us at Rennes-les-Chateau that suggest there's a hidden crypt or a hidden treasure. And we see the same story being repeated at Mount Shasta via the legend of J.C. Brown, which includes a mining engineer named J.C. Brown, who worked for the Lord Caldray Mining Company, that found a tunnel going deep into Mount Shasta, and he discovered rooms full of mummies, golden tablets, and strange weapons and treasure. So this kind of myth matches all of that, and lo and behold, when I researched, that story, two of the biggest names that stick out are Caldray and J.C. Brown. And when I studied the Lords of Caldray in England, I discovered that they were the Montague family that had gained that title through landed ways and intermarriage, but their real name was Brown. Wow. And so the Lord Caldrays of England were actually named Brown. And I believe this kind of legend in the 1930s was exposed to the public to kind of lead people to the assumption that it is associated with the Frenchman's Tower, where we go and see Peter Coutts of the Coutts banking family, who had very close family relations to the Montague Brown Lords of Caldray. And their genealogy is intermarried. And as I said, this includes the Colt family. So all of these suggestions are there that these kind of things, I believe, developed from Constantine the Great. And we know later Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor, there's a lot of legends associated with him in Aachen Cathedral, his octagonal structure, that his descendants were led on kind of a mystery school quest to find his remains and open the vault and find Gnostic information that even included the coronation gospels that were later used to bring in the German kings. So these were part of the ceremony to coronate the kings of Germany. So things like that is meant, I believe, to infer a legendary kind of metaphorical trail that you can follow to the truth. And none of this means there aren't real treasures or things hidden. It could be the remains of people, and this is what's inferred even at Rennes-les-Chateau. I think what Pierre Plantard said that. Things similar to that to know this knowledge shows you are part of the family and have the right to be considered that. So these are things that are taught possibly to gentry groups of people through time, where they learn all of these things and express themselves, and some of them become myths and legends along the way that do involve these kind of landscape arrangements of architecture, artwork, and other things like that do tell you in a very real way. I mean, this information's easy to overlook because we often dismiss the most obvious thing, but when you see a family like De la Tour with their arms including the tower and the Cathar cross of the Languedoc-Roussillon, then you start to see what may be inferred by looking after that and following the trails of clues out that lead you to all of these things that show you this was a mystery school that was created. We often see mystery schools being created to preserve knowledge and history of persecuted groups of people, just like the Christians of early Rome, who created a mystery school in which Christ was represented by the fish or the lamb, and things like that. So these symbols would be understood by them to identify other Christians. So we see the use of Greek mythology, other forms of history, like the history of the Merovingians and everything that they believe they're linked to via their Plantagenet genealogy.
Well, so do you think that this is in some way, could we call it almost an initiatory path to when you're, rather than a treasure map that leads to some kind of tangible treasure?
Right. And
do you think that this is like a pathway to knowledge then?
I think it is a pathway to knowledge, but I think all of it wouldn't have been done without actual items being hidden. Now, whether those things are valuable, golden treasures or information, that's always inferred. And really what I see in Arcadia, the book, the treasure story in there is warning you not to take this too seriously and beware that it's a folly. And then later, even in the famous Beale papers that exposed the Beale cipher of the Beale treasure to the world in the late 1800s, there's a very similar warning. And as I follow that all out, that links directly back to Williamsburg, Virginia, and Jamestown and the early colonists of Virginia that had a lot of family ties to these same groups of people associated with Charles I and II, who were also, kind of the genesis of the Jacobite movement, in that they were beheaded for their faith and kind of lack of cooperation with the Parliament or the representative government of England at the time. So
in Williamsburg, we have another similar mystery of something buried of great value, whether it be documents or whatever, at Bruton Parish Church.
Right. And that one states outright that it is information, that it's the papers of Sir Francis Bacon.
I've always thought that, if we find something, if somebody really finds something, I do hope it's information. I mean, yes, it'd be wonderful to find a gold treasure, but what does that tell us? Really, if it's a bunch of gold coins or whatever it could possibly be, even if it's an item that, of great value that we know about, a legendary item like the Ark of the Covenant, I would really prefer to get knowledge and more information. And that's what I was always hoping for, that would be found at Rennes-les-Chateau, was something that was going to give us some more information. And that would be the biggest find.
Later people, too, I found may have used, that were aware of this, the geographic qualities of buildings possibly pointing, or there being a star in the landscape, could have used this to hide items of value themselves. And we see, like the Knights of the Golden Circle in the Civil War would have been aware of all of this through their heritage stemming from Jamestown and Williamsburg as well. And they may have used it to actually hide treasure later. And the same, let me make this point too. Everything I found out about Arcadia and Philip Sidney, the book Arcadia, doesn't really close the door on there being a treasure at Oak Island. Though we can assume that this whole thing was set up to resemble what was in the book. If you look into the life of Philip Sidney, he was very close friends with Sir Francis Drake, the famous privateer and the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe. And really, in Sir Francis Drake's earlier voyages, he went to Panama, where he actually met up with a French ship that was captained by one of the most famous French cartographers that ever existed, Captain Tetsu. And they both waylaid the mule train coming from the Pacific side of Panama to the Caribbean side. And in the process, Tetsu was killed, and Sir Francis Drake escaped with a large treasure. Now, really, the way the trade winds work and everything in the Atlantic, when people from Europe come to the Caribbean. They take a southerly route down the west coast of Africa where the prevailing currents bring them to the Caribbean. On the way back, they follow the Gulf Stream, which goes right by Oak Island, Nova Scotia. So we see, I mean, there is a slim possibility. There's no recorded, evidence of this, but Sir Francis Drake's close friendship with Philip Sidney may dictate that he told them a story about a treasure hidden in that manner on Oak Island. And it's really interesting because later, when Drake was arranging his circumnavigation voyage, his voyage to Panama was in about 1574 when Arcadia was being written by Philip Sidney. So when it came time to him to disembark for his circumnavigation voyage, or what would become that, Philip Sidney actually showed up at the dock, packed and ready to go with him. And Queen Elizabeth sent an agent to stop him from doing this because he was one of her favorites. So
she didn't want him to go.
Yes, that's how close of a friend he was to Sir Francis Drake, and closely connected with Queen Elizabeth. Wow. And that also leads us to how influential the Wilton Writers Circle of Mary Sidney, the Countess of Pembroke, and her sons being the subjects of the dedication of the first folio of Shakespeare. So it's all involved with all of these suspects that are writers and artists, again, at an earlier date than the Academy of Arcadia, and other groups that are inferred as well that are similar. So all throughout this time, we see this kind of artwork and literature having a real impact and actually possibly containing real information. You interviewed Peter Admondson, who broke the codes in the first folio, and it's amazing because in a way those could be relating to Arcadia, the book. Like a code in Shakespeare is now exposing a concept that's included in the book Arcadia in Nova Scotia. And then when we view it in terms of all of these family relations between William Alexander, Bonnie Prince Charlie, and other Scottish and English nobles, it leads us, to the assumption that there's more to the story than we know what's going on. I mean, I even found direct connections. The American Alexander family that descended from William Alexander owned the property that would become all of Washington, D.C., south of the Potomac River. And they are also the namesake of Alexandria, Virginia. Then, during the Revolutionary War, here comes our Society of the Cincinnati connection again. General William Alexander served under General Lee of the Continental Army and worked in direct command of General Washington and had a very successful record in combat during the Revolution. And then this gentleman was also named William Alexander, General William Alexander. He was the line of succession for the title of the Earl of Stirling. And he actually returned to Scotland and demanded his title after the Revolutionary War. And the Scottish peerage awarded him this, but the English Parliament denied it. But for the rest of his life, he called himself Lord Stirling. And so this is an interesting connection, leading us again to how a lot of American colonists were given land in Nova Scotia after General Lawrence took over. They fought for the colonies during the Revolution and were allowed to retain their properties in Nova Scotia after the Revolutionary War. And this includes the family of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and Edgar Allan Poe.
Oh my gosh. There's that Edgar Allan Poe again. He keeps popping up everywhere.
Right. I believe Poe knew about Rennes-les-Chateau, Oak Island, and the truth of the Newport Tower.
And is that because of his work, The Gold Bug?
That's in part, but Edgar Allan Poe's mother was an Arnold. The same family as Benedict Arnold from Newport, Rhode Island.
Wow.
So he even has direct family connections to the man that history tells us built the Newport Tower, if you disregard the other theories that it's Norse or whatever else.
Right.
History says Benedict Arnold called it his stone-built windmill, which was built by probably Thomas Stafford, the first windmill builder in New England that is also a Plantagenet.
Oh, he's a Plantagenet?
Yes. And Edgar Allan Poe's father was one of the supply masters during the Revolutionary War, making him eligible to be in the Society of the Cincinnati. And later, during the Marquis de Lafayette's last visit to the United States, Edgar Allan Poe, as a young man, served in his honor guard and actually knew and associated with the Marquis de Lafayette.
He was all over it.
Well, there's many possible avenues where Poe could have learned this information via his family connections from his mother, who was just 2 generations removed from the same source as Benedict Arnold Sr. and Jr., or he could have learned this at the University of Virginia while he attended that, while President Jefferson was still alive and known to meet with prominent students.
And, Cort, what was Benedict Arnold's traitorous act?
He decided, this is really interesting because this ties into the treasure legend that you and I have discussed about our friend Matthew McGurn in Western Pennsylvania, Massachusetts. He got in a dispute over Colonel Easton, who also stems from the early residents of Newport, Rhode Island, and may be related to the famous pirate Peter Easton and Thomas Jefferson. He had accused a few of his fellow officers of pilfering a payroll from Fort Ticonderoga. And this really just soured his relationship with his fellow officers so much that in the end he elected to go over to the British side. So that's even part of the treasure there in Western Pennsylvania that, after I got to know Matthew for a while, we discovered that he told me that the property where all of this was located was once owned by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow.
Wow.
So the connections are endless with these artists and literary figures telling us, I think, the truth about these things in a way that it's hard to explain to other people and convince them that it's real. Because, we see in the Gold Bug of Poe, the quote about the bishop having a shot from the devil's chair that reminds us of Rennes-les-Chateau.
Devil's armchair.
There, and other parts of the story with the skull that's reminiscent of the Magdalene penitent and all the paintings that are famous, including a copy of that owned by Thomas Jefferson by the famous artist Rivera. And other elements of the Gold Bug, even the main character's name is Legrand. And this is stated by Thomas Jefferson to have been his favorite architect and also the inspiration for him creating the oval-shaped dome of Monticello based on the designs of Legrand. So in the book, in the story of the Gold Bug, the main character who finds the treasure using the skull in the tree, just like, here we go, the image of Oak Island again. And what I found, this is the kind of really mind-blowing stuff I find. If you go to the star that Henry Lincoln defined in the landscape of Rennes-les-Chateau, after I had noted all of these similarities, the star actually points to Sullivan's Island, South Carolina, where the story of the Gold Bug takes place.
That is wild.
So when I usually what I do, that's what happened to me in the French Tower. Frenchman's Tower, I developed this theory that Henri V was behind it because the similarities in the lives of Peter Coutts in the date ranges and everything involved and what I had found out about the Coutts Bank and everything. And then I found out that Chateau Chambord of Henry V, the Duc de Chambord, the exiled king of France, the linear aspect of his estate in France points to the Frenchman's Tower in Palo Alto, California. I mean, the odds of this, even given a margin of error, given surveying techniques of different eras and different map projections, which I'm well versed in due to my studies.
Sure.
That this is incredible.
Now, you absolutely. You said the Frenchman's Tower in Palo Alto points to Mount Shasta. Where else does it point to?
Well, it's situated in a way that it's due south of the mountain itself, so that creates a prime meridian. And really, I haven't found many other associations using that as an axis with an octagonal scheme like I have the others. But what's interesting is, the Henry V's family name is Artois. And along this meridian created between the Frenchman's Tower and Mount Shasta is the small town of Artois, right near where I live here in Chico, California. And this town was only named that at about the time of World War I, when it was called Germantown. And the real story goes that a troop train came through and stopped in Germantown, and the troops destroyed the town because it was called that. So they changed the name to Artois, which is really interesting too, because Artois means artesian spring. And just recently, the town Corning, which is adjacent to Artois, turned down Nestle to have a bottling plant there of water. And the same thing recently just happened in Mount Shasta in McLeod along the same meridian that's established using the Frenchman's Tower.
Oh boy, I got some ideas about that water, but you know what, Cort? We're gonna have to wrap it up. It's just music is rolling. What can I say?
Hey, well, thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Cort, for being on tonight. I want to thank again Don Ecker and MJ, of course, for coming on with us at the beginning of the show to pay tribute to the wonderful Jim Mars. And we are over and out. Good night, everybody. Thank you, Cort.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night, Jim.
Para mi mamita que me quita mi popó.